Pull up a chair, son. Get close. I want to tell you something. Not the kind of story you read in a book, and not the kind they put in movies where everybody's teeth are perfect and the music swells right on time. No. This is the kind of story that comes from the dirt. The real kind. The kind where a man bleeds for 40 years and gets handed a joke at the end of it, and then, against every logical conclusion, against every rule of the world as it turns out to be, he wins anyway. Not because the world suddenly decided to be fair. It never does. But because the man never stopped being himself. His name was Mark Bates. You wouldn't have looked twice at him on the street. 64 years old, face like a topographic map of Montana, all ridges and valleys carved by wind and sun, and the kind of worry that doesn't ever fully leave a man who has spent his whole life wondering if the work will be enough. He walked with a hitch in his left knee from an old rodeo injury, the kind that got worse when the weather changed, which in Montana means it got worse most of the year. His hands were thick and scarred, the knuckles permanently swollen from the arthritis that had moved in and never left. Arthritis is a way of doing that, making itself at home in the bodies of men who worked too hard for too long. Mark had given 40 years to the Double C Ranch. 40 years. Think about that for a moment. Don't just let the number wash over you, let it sit. 40 years is longer than most marriages last. It's longer than most friendships survive. 40 years is a child being born and growing up and having children of their own. And Mark had given every morning of those 40 years to that land, rising before the coffee pot hissed, before the sky had decided what color it wanted to be. He had given the ranch's youth, his back, the better part of his hearing in his left ear from standing too close to machinery. He had given it the marriage he never had, because a ranch hand's wages don't stretch to engagement rings. He had given it his brother's funeral, missed because it was calving season and someone had to stay. He had given the Double C everything a man can give, which is to say he had given it himself. The man who built the Double C was named Arthur Clark. Now there was a man worth remembering. Arthur was old-fashioned in the very best sense of that word. He knew the name of every horse, every cow, and every hen on his payroll. He knew who among his workers had a sick mother and who was struggling to pay for their kids' school supplies. He shook hands like he meant it, looked you in the eye, and when he said he'd do something, he did it. 3 years before he died, Arthur had pulled Mark aside at the fence line on a cold October evening and told him quietly, not making a production of it, just saying it plain like it was a fact about the weather, that there would be a pension waiting for him. Not a fortune, but enough. Enough to rest. Mark had nodded and gone back to work, and the promise had sat warm in his chest all these years like an ember. But Arthur Clark died. And his grandson, Jensen Clark, inherited everything. Jensen was barely 30. He had the kind of confidence that comes not from having done anything but from having never been told no. He wore designer jeans that were too tight for actual work, boots made from some exotic lizard that had never touched a stirrup in anger, and a gold watch that he checked every 30 seconds like his time was currency too valuable to spend on the men who made his life possible. He talked about efficiency and restructuring and trimming the fat, the language of someone who had read business books but never worked a day in the dirt. To Jensen, a horse was an asset on a ledger. A man was a line item. Sentiment was a liability. The day of Mark's retirement, Jensen gathered the ranch hands in the main barn. Mark stood near the tack room door in his best shirt, a plaid snap button he'd starched stiff the night before, the collar chafing his neck, and waited. He told himself he wasn't nervous. He told himself the trembling in his hands was just the arthritis. Jensen paced back and forth like a man auditioning for a role he already thought he'd gotten. He didn't make eye contact with Mark. He gestured at him once, vaguely, the way you might gesture at a piece of furniture you're explaining to a moving crew. Mark here, he said, has been with us a long time. Too long, Really? A murmur went through the assembled cowboys. Some looked at the ground. Others looked at Jensen with heat in their eyes. Mark felt the words like a punch to the soft part of the stomach. Not because they were cruel, he had survived crueler, but because of who was watching. These were men he had taught to rope, to read weather, to judge the health of a horse by the sound of its hoof fall. And now they had to stand and watch and be dismissed like a worn-out tool. Instead of a cash pension, Jensen continued, a little smile tugging at his mouth. I'm giving you property. You're becoming a landowner, Mark. Moving up in the world. For one mad, blazing second, Mark's heart lifted. A plot of land. Maybe the gardener's cottage. Maybe something with a porch. You know the Cinder Creek tract? The silence in the barn became absolute. Even the horses stopped chewing. Every man there knew what Cinder Creek was. 5 miles out, past where the good grass ended and the rocks began, a jagged stretch of badlands famous for flash floods, rattlesnakes, and a sun that seemed to burn hotter there than anywhere else on Earth, as if God had held a magnifying glass over that particular patch of Montana as a joke. Arthur Clarke had only kept it because it connected 2 grazing allotments. It was a punchline masquerading as real estate. There's a structure on it, Jensen said, struggling now to keep the laughter out of his voice. An old trapper shack. It's yours. Deed and all. He let that settle. Then he snapped his fingers. 2 young stable boys led a horse into the center aisle. And that horse, Lord, that horse. He was a nightmare of neglect made flesh. A gelding, or so it appeared, with a coat the color of dirty soot matted with burrs and dried mud and worse things than mud. His ribs showed through his flanks like the frame of a sunken boat. His hooves were overgrown and cracked, the shoes long gone, the feet misshapen from months or years of neglect. He reared as they brought him in, striking out with those ruined hooves, and his eyes were the worst part. They rolled white in their sockets, and in them was the particular kind of terror that comes not from one bad moment but from a long, sustained experience of pain and betrayal. The terror of an animal that has learned to expect the worst from every living thing. We call him trash, Jensen said, and then he let the laugh come. It echoed off the barn rafters like a gunshot. Trash for the trash heap. You and him deserve each other. Now, a younger Mark, the Mark who had ridden bulls in his 20s, who had broken his nose 3 separate times and each time gone back for more, that Mark might have thrown the lead rope in Jensen's face and planted a fist in that smug, manicured jaw. He had thought about it. For one warm, crystalline moment, he had thought about it very seriously. But then he looked at the horse again. He saw the trembling in the animal's flanks. He saw a creature that had been used up and discarded and mocked and left to rot. He saw something he recognized in the deepest, most private room of himself. He saw himself. Mark placed his hat on his head, pulling the brim low. He walked past Jensen without a word, past the paperwork being thrust at him, past 4 years of his life, and he went to the rearing horse. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't shout. He let out a long, low, vibrating hum, a sound he had used for 4 years to quiet frightened colts, and he took the lead rope from the shaking stable boy. Easy, son, Mark said, his voice like dry leaves on pavement. I got you. I'm not going to hit you. The horse froze. Confused by the sudden lack of violence. Confused by a human voice that held no threat. Come on, Mark said, and his voice broke just slightly at the edges, just enough for someone listening close to hear it. Let's go home. The walk to Cinder Creek was 5 miles of purgatory. The sun beat down on the back of Mark's neck hard enough to blister. The ground was uneven rock and scrub, the kind of terrain that punished knees even young ones, and Mark's were neither young nor in good repair. The horse, whom Mark had already decided, privately and firmly, to rename Cinder, Not because he was trash, but because a cinder is a remnant of fire that still holds heat, a promise of flame that hasn't finished yet, danced and shied at the end of the lead rope the whole way. Every hawk shadow, every rattling sage branch, every gust of wind sent him into a frenzy of snorts and sideways lunges. Mark's shoulder ached from the constant pulling, but he never jerked the rope. He just held on. A steady, grounding anchor. His mind, meanwhile, was a storm. 40 years. He kept coming back to those two words like a tongue finding a sore tooth. 40 years, and he had missed his brother's funeral. 40 years, and he had never saved enough for a ring. 40 years, and this was the thank you, a patch of rattlesnake country in a walking disaster of a horse. But then he looked back at Cinder again, at the heaving ribs and the wild, frightened eyes, and something in his chest hardened into something useful. Something like iron. They want us to die out here, he said to himself, not quite under his breath. Want to drive past in a year and see a pile of bones. Well, he watched the horse for a moment. I've never been good at doing what I'm told. The trapper's shack was worse than imagination. It was a leaning skeleton of gray-weathered wood, the roof sagging like a weary spine, the windows jagged with broken glass that looked like missing teeth, the front porch collapsed on one side. Inside smelled of rat urine and dry rot and the particular emptiness of long-abandoned places. Mark stood in the doorway and looked at it for a long moment. Home sweet home, he muttered, coughing in the dust. Then he closed the door. Behind the shack there was a small barn, older than the house, built from hand-hewn timber gone silver with age. It leaned slightly west, but the roof line was straight. Mark tested the beams. Solid. He spent the last hour of daylight clearing a stall, using a rusted shovel he found in the weeds, his back screaming the whole time. He laid down bedding made from dried tall grass he cut by hand with his pocket knife because he had no scythe. He filled a bucket at the creek, barely a muddy trickle, and led Cinder into the stall. The horse trembled, eyes sweeping the dark corners for threat. Mark had no grain. No hay. One red apple saved from his lunch. He sliced the apple and offered a piece on a flat palm. Cinder snapped at him, ears flat, teeth bared. Mark didn't flinch. He didn't punish. He set the apple on the rail and retreated to the corner of the stall and sat down heavily in the straw, his joints popping out complaints like an old wooden ship in a storm. I know, Mark said to the horse, his voice very soft in the small space. I know you hate us. I know every hand has been a fist and every voice has been a threat. You've got every right to be angry. I'm not going to ask you to change your mind tonight. He didn't go to the house. The thought of the rats and the emptiness was too much. He slept in the corner of the stall, curled up in his denim jacket, listening to the horse pace and snort in the dark. His stomach cramped with hunger. But sometime deep in the night, he heard it, the small, careful crunch of a horse taking an apple. And he smiled, there in the dark, alone. Days became weeks. The routine was grueling and unforgiving in the way that all honest work is unforgiving. Mark rose before dawn, spent 10 minutes just getting his body to cooperate enough to stand upright, and then he worked. He patched the cabin roof with scrap tin. He boarded up windows with reclaimed wood. He scrubbed the floors with river sand until his hands were raw enough to ache at night. He cleared the debris from the barn stalls piece by rusted piece. He hauled water and cut grass and mended fence with wire salvaged from the weeds. But his real work, the work that mattered, the work his soul required, was the horse. Mark came to understand that Cinder wasn't simply wild. He was traumatized in the deep, structural way that takes a long time and a particular kind of cruelty to achieve. If Mark raised a hand too quickly to wave away a fly, Cinder threw himself against the fence, trembling. If Mark picked up a broom, the horse sweated and panicked. If a voice was raised anywhere within earshot, Cinder's eyes went white and wide and the trembling started in his hindquarters and moved forward. "Someone broke your heart before they broke your body," Mark told the horse one morning, watching him from the porch over a cup of watery coffee. "Someone taught you that kindness is always a trick. That every gentle touch is just a delay before the pain." He set the cup down. "I understand that. I do." The turning point came 3 weeks in, announced not gently but with the violence that Montana weather specializes in. The sky turned a sickly bruised green in the late afternoon. The air pressure dropped fast enough to pop ears. Static electricity raised every hair on Mark's arms. Then the thunder came, not a rumble but a cannon crack, a physical blow that shook the canyon walls. Lightning strobed the world white and black. And outside in the makeshift paddock, Cinder was screaming. A high, terrible, keening sound that a horse makes when it has gone past fear into something older and more fundamental. Mark didn't think. He ran. The rain was cold and hard, stinging his face like thrown gravel. He fought through the gate and hurried the frantic animal into the barn. But inside was worse. The thunder on the tin roof was deafening, amplified to something beyond sound, something felt in the chest. Cinder was rearing, striking the walls with his hooves, splinters flying. His eyes had rolled back almost entirely. He was 1,000 pounds of sheer mindless panic, and Mark was alone with him in a small space, and if the horse's hooves connected with him even once it would be over. Mark sat down in the straw, right in the center of the barn, where Cinder could see him but couldn't reach him. He sat down, and he began to sing. It wasn't pretty. Mark's voice was rough as gravel, cracked from years of disuse and cold air and campfire smoke. He couldn't have held a tune at gunpoint. But it was his mother's psalm, an old hymn she used to hum while hanging laundry on dry summer mornings. In a world so far from this one it might as well have been another life. I come to the garden alone, while the dew is still on the roses. Cinder scrambled in the corner, nostrils flaring red, blowing hard. Mark kept singing. He sang through the worst of the thunder, through the rattle and beams, through the lightning that turned the world to white fire. He sang until the words lost their meaning and became just vibration, just warmth, just the sound of a human voice that held no threat. He sang until the adrenaline drained out of him and his chin began to drop toward his chest. He sang himself to sleep in the straw. He woke to warmth. The barn was silent. The first gray light of dawn was threading through the gaps in the timber walls, making small bright rivers in the dust. Mark didn't move. He was afraid to break whatever had happened while he slept. Slowly he opened his eyes. A large velvet muzzle rested on his shoulder. Hot breath moved rhythmically against his neck. Cinder stood over him, head lowered, the white panic gone from his eyes. What was there instead? Mark would spend a long time trying to find the right word for it, and the best he could ever do was curiosity. The soft, open curiosity of an animal that has decided, tentatively, that maybe just this once, just this one creature, might be different from all the rest. The horse let out a long, shuddering sigh. A sound like the releasing of something held too tight for too long. Mark raised his arthritic hand slowly. Cinder didn't flinch. Mark rested his palm against the horse's jaw, the warm skin and strong bone of it, and tears came to his eyes, hot and sudden, the embarrassing kind that ambush you before you can prepare. He hadn't been touched with affection by a living thing in more years than he cared to count. "Morning, partner," he whispered, his voice thick. "We made it." That afternoon, the real revelation began. With trust established, Mark could finally groom the horse properly. He mixed a bucket of warm water, found a stiff brush he'd salvaged from the barn debris, and went to work. The water turned black in 30 seconds. Layer after layer of mud and grime and neglect peeled away, and with it went the illusion. Because underneath the soot-colored filth, Cinder's coat was not plain gray. It was a shimmering, metallic mix of black and white hairs, a blue roan, rare and extraordinary, the kind of coat that catches sunlight and turns it into something that looks like polished gunmetal, like moving water, like a living secret. Mark stood back and stared. Then he kept going. On the horse's hip, hidden under a patch of old scar tissue, his fingers found something unexpected, a ridge of skin, raised and deliberate. He parted the wet hair and looked close. A brand. Not a ranch brand from anywhere around here. A stylized K inside a diamond. A breeder's mark. The kind that means something. He moved to the horse's head. Gently, the way you do with an animal that trusts you and must keep trusting you, he pressed his thumb to the corner of Cinder's mouth and coaxed it open. On the pink inner gum, in fading ink, numbers in a letter. The Jockey Club tattoo. The kind racehorses get. The kind that means a bloodline, a registry, a history. Mark traced the numbers with his thumb for a long time. But chill moved down his spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. "Who are you?" he whispered to the horse. Cinder's dark, intelligent eyes looked back at him with that new steadiness, that hard-won calm. "You're not trash. You never were. You're royalty in disguise." He went to find Martha Higgins. Martha was the town clerk, 60 years old, sharp mind, sharper tongue, in a quiet soft spot for Mark that had existed since high school and which neither of them had ever done a single sensible thing about. She arrived at the cabin in her dusty sedan, stepped out, removed her sunglasses, and looked at the property with wide eyes. The yard was cleared. The windows were fixed. There were wildflowers in pots by the door. "Mark Bates," she said. "You've made a silk purse out of a sow's ear. I thought you'd be living in a tent." "Come see the sow," Mark said, a light in his eyes she hadn't seen in years. When she saw Cinder in the paddock, his blue roan coat gleaming in the afternoon light, moving toward Mark with his neck arched and his gait floating, effortless, the movement of an animal carrying exceptional breeding in every line of his body, she gasped. Her hand flew to her mouth. Mark showed her the photographs he'd taken of the lip tattoo and the sketch he'd made of the brand. "Can you run these? I don't have internet out here, and I don't trust the library computers to not be monitored." "I'll do it tonight," she promised. And then, before she left, sitting on the porch as the sun went down over the canyon, "Mark, I looked at the old survey maps for this place before I came. This parcel sits on a limestone shelf. That spring you cleared, it's not a trickle. It's the overflow of a massive underground reservoir. The main aquifer for the whole valley pinches right here, under your feet." Mark looked at the spring, which had grown since he'd cleared the debris from it, now flowing strong enough to create a small pond in the lower pasture. "So I have water for the horse." "So," Martha said, tapping her cup, "you control the water for the whole valley. The Double C's wells are drying up in this drought. Without your permission, Jensen Clark cannot water a single cow." She paused. "The water rights may be legally complicated. They're often severed from the land deed in this county. Be careful. But Mark, be aware of what you're sitting on." 2 days later, Martha drove back and ran from her car to the porch waving a folder, which is not something Martha Higgins did casually. "Sit down," she said breathlessly. "The tattoo matches the Jockey Club registry. He was reported dead 3 years ago. Stolen from a transport van in Kentucky." She held up the paper. "His registered name is Northern Dancer's Echo. Sire was a Kentucky Derby winner. Dam was a quarter-horse cunning champion, an experimental cross for speed and agility. Mark." She met his eyes. "He was insured for $200,000 as a yearling." Mark sat very still for a moment, watching Cinder chase a butterfly across the pasture like a foal. "Jensen bought him in a bulk auction," Mark said quietly. "From a killed buyer lot. They disguised him with filth because you can't sell a horse with a registered tattoo that's supposed to be dead. Jensen didn't know what he had. He paused. If Jensen knew. A cloud of dust appeared on the horizon. A black truck, shiny and aggressive, bouncing hard down the dirt road. Speak of the devil, Mark said. Jensen stepped out wearing aviator sunglasses and the smile of a man who has come to take something. The smile didn't last. He saw the green, lush paddock fed by the spring. He saw the repaired cabin. And then he saw Cinder, galloping along the fence line, floating over the ground, head high, coat blazing in the sun like hammered metal, and the smile fell off his face entirely. That's the nag, he said. That's Cinder, Mark said, leaning on the gate, blocking Jensen's path. Jensen took off his sunglasses. His eyes did their arithmetic. A horse like that. Water rights like this. His face went through several interesting expressions before settling on something cold and hard. I'm taking him back. The transfer was a mistake. He was a foster situation. I have the bill of sale, Mark said. And the video of you calling in trash and telling me to get off your land. My friend filmed it. Jensen stepped close, expensive cologne cutting through the clean smell of the land. I am the Clark heir. I have lawyers who can bury you in paper until you're dead. I'll find a loophole. I'll condemn the shack. I'll claim you stole ranch property. Mark looked at him for a long, steady moment. Get off my land, he said. It was the first time in his life he had given Jensen Clark an order. The words tasted sweet on his tongue, sweeter than anything had in a long while. Enjoy it while it lasts, old man, Jensen said. I'm going to crush you. The siege began the next morning. Mark woke to find his fences cut. Then a sheriff's deputy arrived with a lawsuit, Clark versus Bates, alleging fraud and elder abuse regarding the land transfer. Then a massive tractor appeared parked across the only access road, blocking Mark's way to town for food and supplies, ostensibly broken down. Mark had the truth. He didn't have money to fight it. Not against the Clark family's legal budget. The walls were closing in. So he went to town the only way he could. He saddled Cinder and rode. He rode up Main Street on the most magnificent horse anyone in that town had seen in years, and people came out of the diner and stopped on the sidewalk and watched in silence. The blue roan moved like something from a different world, something ancient and proud, and the old man on his back sat straight in the saddle with his battered Stetson pulled low and his worn chaps on his legs and his weathered face set like stone. Jensen was at the feed and seat, holding court with some investors. He froze. You blocked my road, Mark said, his voice carrying through the silent store, over the grain bins and the tool racks. Private property disputes are messy, Jensen smirked. Why don't you just sign the deed back over? I'll give you $5,000 cash. Generous. Mark looked around at the townspeople. He saw what was there, the tired resentment of people who had watched Jensen squeeze their community for months, and the fear of people who didn't think there was anything to be done about it. I'm not signing anything, Mark said. But I hear you're entering that warm blood of yours in the Founders Race next month. The Founders Race was 20 miles through the Canyon country, brutal, technical, dangerous terrain. Prestigious enough to matter. I am, Jensen said. My horse cost $50,000. He's going to break the record. Race me. The room went quiet enough to hear a coffee cup set down. Someone actually did set a coffee cup down. The sound of ceramic on Formica was startlingly loud. Excuse me? Jensen said. Race me. If you win, I sign everything back to you, the land, the horse, free and clear. You get everything. And if you win? Jensen asked, the amusement of a man who cannot imagine losing visible in every line of his face. You drop the lawsuit. You unblock the road. You sign a document acknowledging that Cinder and the land are mine, permanent and legal, forever. Jensen looked at Mark's arthritic hands on the saddle horn. He looked at the horse outside the window. A thoroughbred cross would fall apart on rocky canyon terrain. Everyone knew that. Warmbloods were built for it. This was a free win. He extended his hand. You're on. I hope you've got somewhere to live, Mark, because you're going to be homeless. Mark shook it. We'll see, he said. The morning of the Founders race was cold and clear, the starting area chaos of prancing horses, shouting riders, and the sharp smell of liniment and nervous sweat. Jensen sat atop Titan, a massive, handsome Hanoverian warmblood in shining condition, bit hard with a flash noseband and a martingale, decked out with the best equipment money could buy. Jensen himself wore polished tall boots, a pristine helmet, and carried a crop. Mark stood next to Cinder in his old denim jacket and battered chaps. Cinder wore a simple leather bridle with a gentle snaffle bit and nothing else. No tie-downs. No martingale. Just trust. You look ridiculous, Jensen said as he trotted past. That horse is going to break a leg in the scree. Mark patted Cinder's neck and felt the steady pulse beneath his palm. He leaned close and spoke quietly into the horse's ear, not caring who heard him. We don't race him. We run our own race. You trust me, I trust you. The starter's pistol cracked. The pack surged forward. Jensen spurred Titan hard for the front, using the crop to force his way through the bottleneck. Mark held Cinder back, settled him into a long, rhythmic ground-covering trot. The horse wanted to run. His thoroughbred blood was singing for speed and Mark could feel it like a current through the reins, but he listened to the weight shift in the saddle. Not yet. Save it. The first 5 miles were flat. Jensen was a speck ahead of them. Other riders pushed hard, burning their horses fast. Mark stayed back, listening. Cinder's breathing was in, out, rhythmic, strong, easy. Not straining. Not rushed. Then came the canyon. The trail narrowed. The ground turned to loose shale and boulder. This was where the trash land had been, without anyone planning it, the finest possible training ground. Cinder had spent months navigating the rocky terrain of his paddock, learning where to place his feet, how to balance on uncertain ground, how to read what was coming. While other horses stumbled and slid and their riders hauled on their mouths and their horses panicked, Cinder moved like a mountain goat. Sure-footed. Balanced. Quiet. He seemed to enjoy it. They passed riders one by one. Mark didn't push. Cinder simply outlasted them. By mile 15 they were in the top 3. The horses ahead were lathered white, breathing ragged. Cinder was sweating but his ears were pricked forward with interest. Then came Deadman's Drop. A narrow ledge. Sheer drop on one side, canyon wall on the other. A recent rock slide had left a 4-foot gap in the path, jumpable, but terrifying, with the emptiness of air on the wrong side and no room for error. Mark rounded the bend and found Jensen stopped there. Titan was refusing. The big warmblood trembled at the edge, backing away, eyes wild. Jump, you stupid beast. Jensen screamed, and struck the horse between the ears with his crop. Jensen, stop. Mark shouted. He won't do it like that. Jensen didn't stop. He raked his spurs into Titan's sides, and the horse, overwhelmed by pain and terror, did the thing that panicking horses do. He reared to escape. His hind hoof slipped on the loose gravel at the very edge. It happened slowly. Gravel shifting, the massive horse scrambling, losing the geometry of balance. Jensen was thrown clear, sideways, tumbling, gone over the edge. Titan scrambled back to the trail, shaking violently, and bolted back the way he'd come. and Jensen was gone. Mark was at the edge before he'd consciously decided to go there. 20 feet below, on a small rocky outcropping above a 100-foot drop to the river, Jensen lay folded wrong. His leg was bent at an angle that made Mark's stomach turn. "Help!" Jensen's voice was thin and raw. "Mark, I'm slipping. Help me." Mark looked at the finish line. 3 miles away. He could ride past. He could win the race, win the land, win everything Jensen had tried to take from him. No one would blame him. There was not a person alive who could have blamed him. Jensen had brought every bit of this on himself. Mark looked at Cinder. The horse stood motionless, waiting, watching him with those dark, intelligent eyes. And Mark heard, in the silence, the voice of Arthur Clarke, the man who had built the Double C on a different philosophy than his grandsons. "Goodness isn't about what you get, son. It's about what you give when it costs you everything." He dismounted. He untied his lariat from the saddle horn and threw it down. It took 2 tries, but Jensen, weeping with pain and fear, managed to loop it under his arms. Mark walked back to Cinder and looked at him. "Back," he said quietly. The rope went taut. Cinder felt the weight, and something in his great body understood what was being asked. A lesser horse, a more frightened horse, a horse that had not been rebuilt from the ground up on trust rather than force, would have panicked at the strange backward pull, the feeling of being trapped. Cinder lowered his haunches, dug his hooves into the Montana dirt, and walked backward. Step by deliberate step, muscles straining under that extraordinary blue roan coat, he pulled a grown man up the face of a cliff. He didn't slip. He didn't waver. He trusted Mark. Jensen's hands grasped the ledge. Mark grabbed him by the collar and hauled him onto the trail. Jensen lay in the dirt sobbing, his face the color of old ash. Mark checked the leg, broken, cleanly, but bad. He took off his own denim jacket, found 2 sturdy branches, and splinted it with careful hands, binding it tight with his jacket sleeves in his belt. Jensen screamed once and then went mercifully unconscious from the pain. Mark lifted the unconscious man across Cinder's saddle, tied him securely, and took the reins. "We walk from here," he told the horse. They came out of the canyon trail onto the final stretch at a walk. The crowd at the finish line saw them and fell silent. The blue roan stallion, magnificent and sweat dark, head still high, the old cowboy walking on foot in his shirt sleeves, and across the saddle, Jensen Clarke, broken and still. Mark crossed the finish line dead last. For one heartbeat the silence held. Then the crowd erupted, not polite applause but the roaring, stomping, hat-throwing cheer of people witnessing something that cuts through cynicism and reminds them what they believe in. Women wiped their eyes. Men threw their hats in the air. Medics rushed forward. As they loaded Jensen onto a stretcher, he stirred and looked up at Mark through a haze of pain and morphine and something new in his eyes, something that looked, for the first time, like genuine humility. "You saved me," Jensen whispered, gripping Mark's sleeve. "Why?" "After everything." Mark looked at the horse. At the coat that shone like gunmetal in the afternoon light. At the animal that had been called trash and had turned out to be something extraordinary. "Because he's not trash," Mark said. "And neither am I." 2 days later, in a hospital room smelling of antiseptic and lilies, with Jensen's leg in traction and lawyer James Wood standing at the foot of the bed and Martha by the window with her arms crossed, the legal situation was resolved, though not in the way anyone expected. Wood opened a leather portfolio that no one in the room had known existed. A codicil to Arthur Clarke's last will and testament, sealed until its conditions were met. He read, "Whichever individual is in possession of the Cinder Creek tract and successfully rehabilitates a horse on that land, proving their stewardship of the earth and its creatures, shall be granted the executive water rights for the entire valley aquifer." The room went very quiet. The heart monitor beeped steadily, indifferent. "Grandfather knew," Jensen said, his voice barely there. "He knew I'd do this. He was testing me." "He was testing your character," Wood said. "He gave you a choice. You failed." Mark passed. Mark looked at Jensen for a long moment. He had the power, now, to destroy the Double C with a signature. To cut the water, bankrupt the operation, take everything back. He held it all. He had fought his whole life to hold something, and here it was. "I won't cut you off," he said. Jensen stared at him. "The animals didn't do anything wrong," Mark said simply. "But the price of the water goes up to fair market value. Every cent of profit goes into a trust to repair the farms you've squeezed. And you step down as manager. Put someone competent in charge." Jensen closed his eyes. Tears ran from the corners and into his hair. He nodded. "Agreed," he said. A month later, a long silver trailer with Kentucky plates pulled up to the newly named sanctuary at Cinder Creek. An older couple stepped out, wealthy, clearly, in tweed and silk, but with anxious eyes and the careful movements of people bracing themselves for heartbreak. When Mark led Cinder out of the barn, the woman burst into tears. "Echo," she sobbed, burying her face in the horse's mane. The horse, Northern Dancer's Echo, yearling value $200,000, reported dead 3 years prior, nuzzled through her pockets looking for old treats and made a low, soft whicker of recognition. The husband shook Mark's hand with both of his. "We thought he was dead. The police told us to expect the worst. You brought him back." "He did the same for me," Mark said, his throat tight. "We want to pay you a reward. 50,000. And we'll take him home to the bluegrass where he belongs." Mark nodded slowly. He had known this moment was coming. He had prepared for it as best a man can prepare to say goodbye to the thing that saved his life. He looked at Cinder, at the coat he had scrubbed from gray ruin to this, at the eyes that had gone from white-rolled terror to this particular dark steadiness, at the way the horse leaned slightly toward him, the way horses lean toward the person they have chosen. The woman watched all of this. She saw the heartbreak in Mark's eyes and the way the horse ignored her for a moment to nudge Mark's chest with his nose, and she looked at her husband, and something passed between them, the silent language of two people who have loved horses long enough to understand what they're seeing. "Actually," the husband said, clearing his throat, "we've been talking. He's retired from racing. He's found his person." He met Mark's eyes. "We'd like to transfer the papers to you, Mr. Bates. He stays here. On one condition." Mark looked at the horse, then back at the couple. "Name it." "If you ever breed him," the man said, smiling, "we get the first foal." 2 years later, the sun sets over the valley differently than it used to. Or maybe it doesn't. Maybe it's just that the man watching it has changed enough that the same light looks like something else entirely. The old trapper shack is gone, replaced by a sturdy log lodge with a wraparound porch and flower boxes overflowing with color. A hand-carved sign over the gate reads, "The Sanctuary, a place for second chances." Mark sits in a rocking chair with a cup of hot coffee in his arthritis and his memories and more peace than he knew what to do with at first. The pasture holds 10 horses now, old broodmares and a blind pony and a lame gelding and a few others that the world had finished with, all of them grazing in the long golden light of evening. And standing watch over all of them, his coat catching the last of the sun and turning it into something that looks like a banked fire, like something that has survived and remembers it, is Cinder. The horse lifts his head and sees Mark on the porch and calls out to him, a whinny of pure, uncomplicated joy that bounces off the canyon walls and comes back doubled. Mark lifts his coffee cup in return. He leans back. He lets the rocking chair do what it's built to do. The world had called them trash. Jensen Clark had called them a joke. They had been given a rattlesnake shack and a death sentence and a horse that was supposed to die. And they had built a paradise. That's the truth of it. That's the whole truth. It doesn't fit on a trophy. It doesn't make a good bumper sticker. But if you're quiet enough, and patient enough, and willing to do the work that nobody watches you do, if you're willing to sit in the dark in a stall and sing your mother's song to a horse that doesn't trust you yet, then maybe, somewhere in the country of your own life, you'll find that the trash land is where the water is. That the trash horse carries the blood of kings. That the things the world threw away were only thrown away because nobody had the patience to see what they were. Mark Bates knew. He'd always known, if he's honest. He just needed one last chance to prove it. Now you know too. Now, you finish that coffee and get some sleep. Big day tomorrow.